Hi there, I'm Ron, and welcome back to Farbliss Creations. Today we'll be taking a look at how I designed and built these cedar grape trellises for the size of our front porch. At 8 feet in height, they're definitely one of the larger projects I've ever completed, and I love how they turned out. I'll have links down in the description for downloadable plans if you're interested in building one of these yourselves, but first, let's take a look at how they're made. I, like many makers out there, have a honey-do list that is many miles long. This project was one of the more recent additions that got bumped to the top of the list because the hubby had already bought the grapes and decided they needed to be transplanted to their permanent home, sans trellis. And without anything to climb onto, they were getting a little tipsy. As for placement, we decided to put the grapes on the left and right side of our open front porch. A few of our neighbors down the block have grapes growing along a 4-foot chain link fence running down the side of their front yard, which works well for them, but we didn't want to install a fence in the front and thought putting a trellis up would be a nice way to add some additional late afternoon shade to our porch, should we ever want to put a bench or Adirondack chairs out there. So it was time to get designing. The hubs and I had collected a few reference photos of vertical trellises that we liked and pared it down to a few options. We plan to put a pergola over the cement pad we have in the backyard at some point, so I figured it'd be nice to have these complement each other, despite being on different parts of our property. What that meant was leaning more towards a design that had a pergola-like cap at the top, and being made of cedar. This rose trellis came up in my search and looked a lot like what I had in my head, but there were a few aspects I didn't like. For instance, it appeared as though the horizontal cross members are made of copper pipe, which I felt like grapes might have a hard time gripping onto, if not get burned in the sun. Also, I didn't love how the vertical cross members terminated shy of the top and bottom. I felt like they should continue through to hide their end grain. Overall, I liked it though, and I decided to use it as a basis for my design. So, with that rough idea of what I wanted our trellises to look like, I took to the computer to try to make myself some plans in Autodesk Fusion 360. I really want to learn this program, as when I start doing stuff on the CNC, it'll be invaluable to me. But after an hour of futzing around in there without much luck, I decided to switch to my tried and true Adobe Illustrator. After all, it was a Saturday, and I needed to get to the Home Depot to purchase my lumber before their cedar supply was wiped out by other weekend warriors. Now I know Adobe Illustrator isn't a CAD or physical world design program, but I mostly just needed to be able to work in 2 dimensions here. This trellis was only going to be about 6 to 8 inches in depth, and I could do what few 3rd dimension calculations there were to do in my head. So ignoring the 3rd dimension temporarily, I used Illustrator to plan out the front profile. The most important measurement for these things would be the width. The space between the face of our house and the backside of the pillars of the front porch measured exactly 60 inches. I definitely wanted them no wider than this so that they could be centered in this space, but I actually wanted a few inches of clearance on each side too, so I knocked off 6 inches from that measurement and came up with an overall width of 54 inches for the widest part of my design. Now the widest part would actually be the cap that sat atop the trellis as a decorative feature. I determined after a little playing around with the design that this would overhang about 5 inches on each side. This brought down the overall width for the grapes to climb to about 44 inches. This was a reasonable accommodation because it made sense to me compositionally from a design perspective. I tend to fixate over fine details like this, but I like to think it pays off. Originally when doing the design, I was planning on using 8-foot cedar posts for the frame, resulting in a trellis that was 6 feet high after burying 2 feet in the ground. This raised it a decent amount off the ground, but from the perspective of someone actually up on the porch, they appeared to be only maybe 4 feet high or quite low, because the porch itself was a few feet off the ground. I was prepared to be okay with this, but while I was at the Home Depot, I noticed they had 10-foot 4x4 cedar posts too, which I didn't know was a thing. So I tweaked my design a bit to be 2 feet higher, and then went with those instead, as it meant the final trellises would be 8 feet tall once completed, which felt a little more natural from up on the porch. For the intersections between the horizontal and vertical supports on the internal framing, I would have loved to have done lap joints with squared lumber, but being my garage shop conversion is still a work in progress, it would have been far too much work to try to get that many lap joints cut without a crosscut sled, dado stack, or anything that makes that kind of thing easy. So I decided to design to my capabilities, both in terms of my woodworking skill and tool access. Plus, I've never done much traditional woodworking or joinery, so trying to get that many lap joints perfectly aligned for the first time on 10-foot cedar posts that cost about $45 each didn't exactly sound fun. So what I decided to do instead was use dowels for the horizontal cross members. All that this required was perpendicular holes be drilled through all my vertical pieces, where dowels could simply be slid through to create the internal framing. The downside to this was that 1-inch dowels at the store were kind of spendy for what they were, and I needed 16 of them, but it was a trade-off I was willing to pay to simplify my project. After collecting my lumber, I had a bit of prep work to do with some of the boards. Despite wanting to do most of this in my driveway, there were a few tools at the makerspace that made a few tasks easier. One of the most critical parts was on the thinner boards that made up the vertical uprights between the 2 primary posts. The size of the board I needed here was only available in S3S at the Home Depot. If you're unfamiliar with this terminology, like I was when I first got started, that stands for surface 3 sides, meaning the fourth side was completely rough sawn and splintery, straight from the sawmill. I wanted my trellises to look good from all sides, so I needed to plane down the roughness on this fourth side on all these boards. I don't have a planer at home, so thankfully the makerspace did. This made quick work of all my boards and smoothed them right up. If you can find the proper size boards that are already planed on all four sides, obviously you wouldn't need to do this. After all the boards were planed, I decided to drill my holes through all of them while I was still at the makerspace. I have a drill press at home, but it's smaller, and the one at the makerspace is a standing unit with a lot more vertical working area. With this increased working area, I was able to clamp my boards together before drilling my holes, allowing me to get away with only marking a few of the boards rather than all of them. This would also reduce the chance for error on hole spacing from board to board, ensuring the dowels lined up through the boards without any problems. My drill bit wasn't long enough to go through each set of boards entirely, but it was enough to mark the spot on the lower boards, which had the effect of transferring the hole location precisely for me to come back and do these later. One other thing I decided to do while I was at the makerspace was to use the bandsaw to cut the quarter circle out of the decorative cap faces. I could have done this with a jigsaw at home, but I for some reason don't have any proper sawhorses right now, so this was easier. Alas, I forgot to cut the bottom arch while I was at the makerspace, so I would need to whip out the jigsaw later anyway. After the circles were cut, I smoothed them out on the belt sander and then routed the edges on the router using a 1/4 inch roundover bit. Once home, I realized my mistake of forgetting to cut the bottom arch, so I printed out a 1:1 scale template of the face and transferred the template to the piece of wood by pressing firmly with a center punch. I made it more visible with a Sharpie. Since I didn't have any suitable sawhorses, I clamped both the front and back boards together and raised the boards up off the tailgate of my truck using clamps. This worked not great, but good enough. A lot of sanding on the belt sander and cleanup with a random orbital sander needed to be done afterwards to get a passable finish on this cut. Hopefully next time I remember all of my cuts when I have access to the tools to do them properly. One thing I had done before heading to the makerspace to prep the rest of the lumber was drilling the holes in the cedar posts that would receive the dowels. Like I said, I have a drill press, but it's small. These cedar posts, while large and heavy, weren't so bad to contend with by having the drill press resting flat on the driveway with the overhanging end supported really well. Each trellis would have 8 dowels, so on each post I drilled halfway through the post with a Forstner bit as to have clean, flat-bottomed holes. I was using 1-inch dowels, so I used a 1-inch Forstner bit as well to drill all the holes in this project. But during some initial test fitting, I discovered that it was quite the friction fit, such that trying to slide each of these 8 dowels through the 4 boards was going to be quite challenging. I soon learned that a 1 1/16 inch Forstner bit would have been more appropriate for the holes to make the 1-inch dowels fit easier. But they were already drilled and I didn't have that size bit anyway, so I instead decided to sand the dowels down a little bit. Had I a lathe, I would have chucked each dowel up on the lathe and made quick work of the sanding that way, but I didn't have a lathe, so instead I decided to sand each dowel with a random orbital sander while rolling it by hand in the driveway. This is hands down one of the more tedious tasks I've ever created for myself, but when you don't have the right tool for the job, sometimes you gotta improvise. Oh, and before sanding, I cut the dowels down to size on my miter saw to make sure I wasn't sanding more than I needed to. After repeated tests to make sure each dowel finally fit the 1-inch holes of the vertical uprights loosely enough, I could finally begin assembly. After placing all the dowels in one of the uprights, I laid one of my 10-foot cedar posts down in my driveway, hole side outward, facing the dowels. After fiddling momentarily to get all 8 holes lined up with their mating dowel, I stood the assembly up on end. Using my fancy hammer, I tapped the dowels lightly until the pitch of the thud changed slightly, letting me know they had bottomed out in their holes, guaranteeing the trellis would be the same width at all points once assembled. I then began the slightly tedious task of getting the first vertical upright into its final position. I cut 2 spacer boards for spacing the uprights, one for the outermost ones and one for the inner ones, to make sure the spacing was correct along the length. But I also struggled with this task, again because of how tight the holes were on the dowels. I'll recommend a larger drill bit on my written plans. After trying a few different methods of tapping the upright down, I landed on the most absurd looking method that turned out to be the most effective, and that was using a 3 to 4 foot length of 2x4 held tight in one arm and guided with my opposite hand to tap the board down, changing my strike to land between different dowels as the board lowered into place. Once my smaller spacer board fit perfectly into each gap, I secured the board in place with a few screws so that further vibration wouldn't cause the board to lose alignment. With my brute force technique down, the next 3 boards went quite quickly. For each upright, I used my spacer block to get the board close to its final position and then again used screws to secure the dowels with pre-drilled holes. After the final horizontal upright was tied in, I hoisted the other 10-foot 4x4 up on top. This was also a moment of truth in a way. With the lower boards, if the alignment of the holes was slightly off, the dowels had plenty of length to accommodate minor fluctuations by bending ever so slightly. But here at the top of the assembly, with only about 7 inches to work with, they would be far less likely to be convinced if their placement was off. Thankfully, I didn't have any issues, and the second post went on relatively smoothly. After using a few more screws to tie things together, it was time to call it a night as the sun had retired for the evening. The next morning, with all the internal framing done, I could turn focus to the decorative cap. This would be attached with 6-inch by 1/2 inch carriage bolts. I drilled oversized holes in the 4x4 posts themselves, but the faceplates got a 1/2 inch hole to perfectly receive the carriage bolt. Because carriage bolts have a square shaft directly below the rounded cap, I needed to chisel out the corners of the front board's holes to make them square. The holes in the 4x4 posts were oversized to make aligning the front and back boards easier, but it also came in handy later to adjust the leveling of the cap on one of the trellises that looked a little crooked at the top once we had already set it in the ground. After the cap was secured, only one more piece was needed, and that was the horizontal crossmember along the bottom of the trellis to hide the bottom ends of the vertical uprights. I just used screws to secure it to the 4x4 here, but later decided to replace these with carriage bolts to look a little more polished and match the top of the trellis. With the first trellis done and the hubby's seal of approval received, we could move it to its final resting spot and put it to work in supporting the grapes. But not before the hubby dug 2 feet down for the post to go in, a task he was all too prepared for. With the holes dug, we carried it into place and carefully raised it up and set it down in the prepared holes. The hubby held it in place while I went through my perfectionist field inspection from various angles to make sure it was placed correctly before we leveled it. We ended up kicking a little dirt back into one of the holes to help level it from side to side, before using a spare 4x4 to hold it in place while we leveled it from front to back. Once I was satisfied with how it looked from every angle, we could secure the post into the ground. We decided to use an expanding foam post filler I'd seen on YouTube a few times, rather than mess around with mixing cement. It's incredibly strong and quick setting, and pretty easy to use. My only complaint was that it was hard to know when to stop filling a hole, as to not to have too much overflow. The first trellis we mounted we poured way too much, and it sort of did a mushroom cloud effect, requiring a lot to be cut off. On the next set, I tried dividing a single bag of post filler between 2 posts, but that ended up not being enough, and I needed to use another one. In truth, this is likely our fault, as we didn't dig the holes as wide as the bag implied, since this was a tight space with grapes already planted, but it wasn't too big of a deal. Once the foam had cured, I used my reciprocating saw to cut off the excess, and then, don't laugh, I used my shop vac to clean up the foam dust from the dirt nearby the post. Yes, I was vacuuming outside. After cleanup, we could reapply mulch to cover the holes in foam and call this project complete. That is, after building a second one and doing it all over again on the other side of the porch. Well, there you have it. Now this is quite the project, being the largest thing I've ever constructed, making it slightly intimidating at first. Despite running into a handful of silly hurdles along the way, it was a great learning opportunity, and of course the second one went way faster than the first after having learned from it. If you're interested in building one of these yourselves, I'll be creating downloadable plans, and I'll have them linked in the description for you to check out. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, cheers.